Hello everyone, this is Pathak and you're watching my channel. So today I will talk about the hospital policies, okay? And you can also see the Instagram ID on the slide, which is Healthcare for You Forever. So you can follow my account over there. So let's get started with this particular presentation. So today I will talk about the first chapter, access assessment and continuity of care. So I will talk about the various policies which are present under this chapter. So the first policy here on the slide is the registration and admission policy, that how registration and admission of patient is done in the hospital. Policy 2 is non-availability of beds policy. So if there's non-availability of beds, beds are not present in the hospital, so what should be done in the hospital? Then policy 3 is transfer or referral policy, how to transfer a patient from one department to another department. Then policy 4 is discharge policy, which tells about how to make discharge process for the patient. Then policy 5 is leave against medical advice policy. If the patient wants to leave before the prescribed day, then what kind of procedure action should be taken? Policy 6 is scope of services policy, that what are scope of the services in the hospital, what kind of services are provided in the hospital. Policy 7 is initial assessment policy, the initial assessment which is taken for the patient to check the BP, the blood pressure, the temperature, okay, and the weight and the height and everything. Then policy 8 is prioritization policy, to prioritize the patient on the basis of its criticality of the disease or any you know injury. Then policy 7 is laboratory safety program policy. Then policy 10 is laboratory policy. Policy 11 is laboratory quality assurance policy. Then policy 12 is imaging services policy. Policy 13 is imaging services quality assurance policy. And policy 14 is imaging services safety program policy. Okay, so all of these policies, which I stated from 9 to 14, it's related to laboratory department and imaging department. So laboratory is where all these tests are conducted, like lipid profile, like your WBC test, your RBC test. Then imaging services includes like X-ray, ultrasound. So these were the policies under the chapter number 1, access assessment and continuity of care. Now I will talk about the policies under the chapter number 2, care of patients. So policy 1 here on the slide is uniform care policy, to provide uniform care to all the patients. Then policy 2 is triage policy, to segregate the patient on the basis of criticality. So there's a triage. Policy 3 is ambulance policy. Policy 4 is emergency policy. Policy 5 is CPR policy, which is cardiopulmonary resuscitation policy. Then policy 6 is nursing care policy, how to provide nursing care to the patients. Policy 7 is informed consent policy, where consent is taken from the patient for the procedure, for the surgery. Policy 8 is transfusion services policy. So services that includes the blood products, it comes under the transfusion services policy. And policy 9 is obstetric care policy. Policy 10 is pediatric care policy. Obstetric is related to mother and the child, and the pediatric is related to child. Policy 11 is sedation policy. Policy 12 is anesthesia policy. Policy 13 is surgical services policy, how to provide surgical services to the patient. Then policy 14 is organ transplant policy. Organ transplant, how to transplant the organ from one patient to the another, so that is also really very important. Then other policies under this particular chapter are policy 15, pain management policy, has to how to maintain the pain, or how to manage the pain of the patient. Policy 16 is rehabilitation service policy, how to provide rehabilitation services to the patient after the surgery. Policy 17 is telemedicine policy. Policy 18 is clinical procedure policy. Policy 19 is radiation safety policy, to protect the patients and the healthcare professionals from the radiation that occurs in the imaging services department. Then policy 20 is ICU policy. Policy 21 is adverse event policy. Adverse event, like any kind of event which can make a patient, you know, very vulnerable, or very, um, or prone to a particular disease. Then whatever patient policy, policy number 22. Policy number 23 is antenatal care policy. Then policy number 24 is patient fall policy, how to manage the patient or how to handle the patients if they fall in the hospital. Then policy 25 is bed sore policy. Policy 26 is restraint policy. Then restraint is to make the patient, you know, in control, because sometimes patient get very, you know, violent when they are not in their senses. Okay, then policy 27 is deep vein thrombosis policy. So these were the policies under the chapter number 2, care of patients. Chapter number 3, management of medications. So policy number 1 is pharmacy policy. Policy number 2 is drug formulary. Policy 3 is implantable prosthesis policy. Policy 4 is narcotic drugs policy. Policy 5 is chemotherapeutic drug policy. Policy 6 is psychotropic drug policy. Policy 7 is emergency medication policy. Policy 8 is high risk condition policy. Policy 9 is adverse drug reaction policy. Policy 10 is near miss policy. Policy 11 is look alike, sound alike policy. Okay, look alike, sound alike drugs. Okay, so this comes under management of medication. So you can see that there are different kinds of drugs available in the drug pharmacy department of the hospital: chemotherapeutic, psychotropic, emergency medications. So these come under the management of medications. Next is chapter number 4, which is patient rights and education. So let's see what are the policies under this particular chapter. So policy 1 is patient rights and responsibilities policy. Policy 2 is informed consent policy. Policy 3 is complaint policy. Policy 4 is effective communication policy. So effective communication should always be there. Okay, because if there's no effective communication, so patient will get confused, the doctor will also get confused. So that is very, very, important to control. Then policy 3 is complaint policy. Complaints should always be given to the hospital whenever there's a problem, because if if no complaint is solved, or if the patient is actually suffering from any particular disease or a problem in the hospital, so that should be totally, resolved as soon as possible. Next, chapter number 5, hospital infection control. So the policies are under this chapter. Policy number 1, infection control policy. Policy number 2, hand hygiene policy. Policy number 3, standard precaution policy. Policy 4, antibiotic stewardship policy. Policy 5, infection and infusion practices policy. Policy 6, transmission based precautions policy. Policy 7, biomedical waste management policy. Policy 8, laundry and linen management policy. Policy 9, antimicrobial usage policy. Policy 10, housekeeping policy. Policy number 11 is kitchen sanitation and food handling policies. Then policy 12 is infection control engineering policy, infection control construction and renovation policy, then immunization policy, and post-exposure prophylaxis policy. So these were the policies of the first 5 chapters of the NABH Standards 5th edition. And so these were all the, patient-centric chapters. And in next video, I will talk about the policies under the organization-centric chapters. I hope you really like this video. Please do not forget to like, share, subscribe my channel. I will meet you in the next video. Bye bye. Stay tuned. Stay safe and healthy.